Well, welcome everyone. We'll get underway. Thank you for coming out on a Blenheim evening. Most of us, there's quite a few here who have been part of a training day that we've been running here as part of the Anglican Diocese. So my name is Graham O'Brien and I'm an Anglican minister based in Nelson. I work for the Bishop's Ministry team in our theological college over in Nelson. My background is actually in science, so I've got my PhD's in genetics. And I've got a master's degree in theology, majoring in ethics. So one of the roles that I do for the Anglican Church is I co-chair a group called the Interchurch Bioethics Council. So we are actually the only dedicated ethics council in New Zealand, because the government disbanded its one a few years ago. So we represent the Anglican, Methodist and Presbyterian churches across Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia. And this is one of the issues that we've been talking about and discussing over the last several years. So it's great to be able to come today to talk. I don't want to assume that everyone is on the same page on this issue. So I'm hoping we can have a good conversation around the topics. The stats tell us there's probably 20% who are definitely one way or the other, but there's 60% of New Zealanders are sitting in the middle and don't quite know which way they're going to vote. Can this go down a bit? So it is an important conversation and a really important issue. It literally is life and death, to put it bluntly. So we're going to explore the issue tonight. The bulk of my presentation will take probably about an hour, and I want to have a good time for question and answers. So there might be some questions you have during the time, and there might be some pauses that we can discuss those questions, but we'll see how we go. So today we are looking at the End of Life Choice Act, and the question you're facing, or we're all facing, is a yes or no answer. Are we for it or are we against it? And that's kind of the issue we're talking about today. Big part of this plays into is all our experiences around people we know and love who have faced illness, who have suffered and who have died. That plays into a lot of this discussion because we all have had personal experience of that. And so in our discussions, it's very hard to separate the issues kind of academically and pragmatically from the issues of our own experience. So I want to acknowledge that. So when you come into the polling booth, you're going to be presented with this question. Do you support the End of Life Choice Act 2019 coming into force? And you're going to be asked to tick yes, I support it, or no, I do not support it. A little show of hands, who has actually read the Act? So who's read the parliamentary legislation, not the little pamphlet that came through the mail? So there is a few. That's cool. It's the parliamentary bit. It's really important to know that this is a unique situation for New Zealand. You are going to be asked to vote and pass a law into being, or not. You are not being asked, do you agree with end of life choice or not? You're actually voting on a very specific piece of legal legislation. If 50.1% of the country, the majority of the country, vote yes, then this law, unchanged, becomes actionable 12 months' time. So we're not voting to put it back to Parliament to talk about it and to change it. We're actually voting for this law as it stands, unchanged, end of story. So it's really important that actually we know what we're talking about. So, when you sign a house contract, you tend to read through the fine print, don't you? When you buy a car, you read through the fine print. You're voting for a law, a legal document. So it's really important that you know what you are voting for and what you are saying yes or no to. We also have a situation where we've got two referenda happening at the same time. So you're going to be asked two sets of questions. Now, it's important to recognise that those two referenda are different. This one is binding. If we vote yes to this one, it becomes law unchanged. The cannabis one is not binding. If we vote yes or no to that one, it still goes back to Parliament for tweaking and discussion. So yes, we have two referenda, but it's important to realise they are not equal. It's not as if we're voting for the same thing. This one, and we could talk about the other one later if people have questions, but this one is binding. What we decide at the polling booth is what becomes law or not. So, what is this act about? What is this piece of legal legislation about? This law is about giving a person with a terminal illness and who meets certain criteria the option of lawfully requesting and receiving, so it's not just about asking for it, it delivers it as well, medical assistance to end their lives. And it establishes a lawful process by which they can get the assistance and exercise the option they want to take, which means they can ask for it, they can receive it, and those that help them enact this law and enact their choice cannot be prosecuted under the law for doing so. Now that's important because this law will be the only law in New Zealand that will legally allow someone else to end the life of another person. Okay? So that's important to note. This law is the only law that will allow person A to legally end the life of person B. And they're doing so for the purpose of the Act to relieve suffering. So some of the conditions: the patient, the person who's seeking this, must raise the issue. The doctor cannot say, "Have you thought of this?" The person themselves must raise the issue. Now it's very hard to prove that's happened when the only other witness, might be dead after the fact, but that's the law. The person must raise it, not the doctor. The person must be over 18 years of age. So that's the age limit that the government has set. Now it's worth noting that the Attorney General, who looks at all our laws and says are they valid, has looked at this and compared it to our National Bill of Rights. And the Attorney General has said, actually, 18 is fairly arbitrary. Most of our other laws enact at the age of 16. So during the discussion process, the Attorney General was saying it should be 16 or we have no legal age limit at all, which means any age is possible. So just know that at the moment the law says 18, but that's an arbitrary line that the politicians have given it. The person has received a terminal prognosis of 6 months or less. Now when you speak to doctors, they'll say diagnosis is pretty scientific and accurate. Prognosis, which is how long you have, they would actually say is more of an art form. It's very hard to pin down exactly how long a person has to live when they have a terminal illness. So it's likely that they will live no more than 6 months. So the likely is an important word. So it doesn't have to be definitely, you will only live 6 months, but it's likely. Now the other thing with that is it does not take into account any treatment you may receive to lengthen your life or to potentially cure you. So any treatment is irrelevant to this bill. The doctor, you can go in, here you've got a terminal prognosis, and say you would like this, and the doctor doesn't have to say, oh, but have you thought about XYZ treatment which may potentially cure you, could lengthen your life further. That is irrelevant for the bill. The bill does not take into account any treatment that you may or may not receive. So that's another important point to recognise. And the person has to be deemed competent. They've got to be deemed mentally competent, which means basically the doctor has to repeat several times, and you have to be able to repeat back to the doctor that yes, this is what you want. We'll talk about that a little bit later, because my view would be the safety, the competency issue is pretty light in our bill, which is a bit of a concern. So those are some of the general criteria that this bill enacts. So what is it talking about when it talks about someone being able to go and receive assistance to end their life, to end their suffering? This act is about a process called, what the Act calls, assisted dying. That's the terminology this Act uses. And it's defined in two ways. The first way is the administration by an attending medical practitioner or an attending nurse practitioner. So that's an important point to note, because this bill is now not just about a doctor being able to do it, but they've also now included nurse practitioners as a group of people who can also enact the law upon request. So two groups of people are now deemed the kind of medical practitioners. So a medical practitioner or doctor and an attending nurse practitioner administer medication to the person to relieve that person's suffering by hastening death. And you'll see I put some words in yellow because we need to unpack what those words mean. This is a law, and I don't know if you've ever been to court, but lawyers are very particular about words, and legal documents are based on words and what they mean. And one of my arguments for this bill in particular is that actually its words are very fluffy and very nondescript in places. And so the law is not as tight, I think, as it could be. So the other option is the self-administration by a person of medication to relieve their suffering by hastening death. So scenario one, a doctor or nurse practitioner delivers medication. Scenario two, a person has asked their doctor, they've received medication from the pharmacist, and they go and take that medication themselves. Do you understand the two scenarios? When you hear those two scenarios, just for 30 seconds, maybe turn to your neighbour. What scenarios does this kind of bring to mind? What scenarios do you think about when you read that and you think, okay, this is the law that I'm voting for? What scenarios run through your head? And just talk to your neighbour for 30 seconds. I know that's a very quick little discussion. Would anyone like to offer up the kind of scenarios that come to their mind when they read this? Yep.
On the B, we go down to pharmacists to recommend or go somewhere and use it. That could be abused. Someone could go take great medication and give it to someone else.
That's another issue, but yes. What are the scenarios around which someone might want to go through this?
Read your relatives.
Potentially, yeah. So that would be pressure from family.
Someone who doesn't understand treatment options.
Yeah, if they haven't been talked through treatment options, yeah.
In the case of self-administration, what happens if the person has a caregiver staying with them all the time, 24 hours, if the caregiver is expected to take that responsibility?
No, the caregiver can't because they're neither a doctor nor a nurse practitioner. So it's only very specific people. So a caregiver or family member cannot be the ones delivering the medication. Yeah. But what kind of conditions would you think someone... Yeah.
What about people with kidney failure? They could absolutely refuse to have no more dialysis.
Yes, they could.
And I mean, that would be their life.
Yes. So one of the tensions with the bill is there's a fine line between, for example, disabled and terminal, because you can stop taking medication or receiving care or treatment that can actually prolong your life. But actually, because you've stopped taking it, you are now terminal. It's likely that you'll die. Dialysis is a good example. We've had family members go through that. And if you know anything about dialysis, it's a hugely invasive process. They've got to put whopping great big needles in their arms, and it's, but someone on dialysis could choose to stop that because it's hugely invasive. It causes them suffering, both physical and mental. Now they are terminal. Now they can request end-of-life choice. So the bill, as I said earlier, doesn't take into account any treatment options.
I've to have absolute confidence in your medical.
Yes, you have to have absolute competence. And often the scenarios we see around this is, someone with terminal cancer, they've been given a diagnosis. That's often the common one you see in the media. But actually there's a... Sorry?
I was imagining a caring environment.
I missed that, sorry.
I was imagining a
Caring. Oh, yes, yep. So as in care homes, hospice, yep.
Or in somebody's home. Or...
Yep. So with those definitions, one of the
Oh, we just thought that the first one could be most likely to take place at a hospital or a home. The second one, at home or your personal home, but it's more of a suicide rather than
well, it's been, we'll come back. The next slide talks about some terminology. So the first, technical terms matter. The first process whereby someone delivers it to you, either by pill or lethal injection, is actually a term called euthanasia. That's actually the process. That's the technical term for what is happening. Now again, one of the complaints of the bill is they've softened it by using this term assisted dying. But actually what the bill is bringing about is this practice called euthanasia, where through either giving a lethal dose of pills, which would necessitate a tube into the stomach, direct access, or lethal injection, someone's life is ended. The second approach is what's called assisted suicide, where you do it to yourself, but you're assisted by your doctor and your pharmacist by getting the medication required. And again, that can be by pill, or it can be by, you can get a lethal injection self-pump, a bit like the morphine pump, if you like, but not morphine in this case.
Does the Act specify whether that has to be witnessed by somebody?
The Act says that the doctor or nurse practitioner must be in the vicinity. In the vicinity. It doesn't say they need to be in the same room. It doesn't specify. So one of the problems we'll look at overseas is that actually 6 to 10% overseas, 6 to 10% of incidences of euthanasia-assisted suicide go wrong. So, people regurgitate up the drugs because your body doesn't want a lethal dose of drugs. People can go into a coma and then wake up again. So it's not a foolproof system. That's what I'm trying to say. And if we think this is the answer to suffering, I think, personally, we're wrong. So be very clear that actually what this bill is bringing about is two specific practices. The first is called euthanasia, and the second is called assisted suicide. Now, we'll look at some numbers later, but most countries around the world that have brought in this kind of legislation only bring in assisted suicide. Very few places in the world allow both. So automatically our bill puts us in a very unique group of countries that allow both.
So it's almost like a new tourism branch.
Yeah, you can't do that. They only do that in Switzerland.
Yes.
Yeah, but we can't.
It was just the beginning.
Yeah.
Like your first slide said, slide said that the patient needs to bring it up by himself. That used to be with abortion the same thing. I know of a couple that had a baby with Down syndrome, and it was constantly brought up right to delivery. Every time again by the doctors, oh look, we can make it away.
That is one of the challenges. Yeah, that is one of the challenges, and we'll get to a slide later which looks at where we see overseas trends going, because that's important for us to recognise. We're bringing this in, but other countries have been doing it. What's happened in those places? But for our...
Is there a reason why countries aren't doing both?
Generally speaking, if you allow both, the majority of people opt for euthanasia. Because if you're having a doctor do it to you, it kind of seems okay, would be the rationale. And in countries that allow both, the rates are about 10 times higher than if you just have assisted suicide only. So part of the discussion of this bill was that actually it gives people a choice and enables them to, relieve their suffering in their own manner at the time that they want. But actually our bill by what it's doing, is actually going further than that, I believe, because it's offering two options, which the majority of the world have actually rejected. And we'll look at that a bit later. So the first point is actually what we are talking about are these two practices, euthanasia or assisted suicide. This idea of assisted dying really is a bit of a softening of what this legislation brings about. And it kind of groups this practice in with every other legal palliative practice that we do in this country. So in a sense, it's making these two part of the normal range of medical practice we do around end-of-life issues. And I think that's a bit wrong. The other couple of words that I highlighted there that I think are worth noting, it talks about medication. Now, most of us take medication so we feel better. So it helps us live our lives. Who here is on medication? Who's not on cholesterol medication? Very few. Who's on? Yeah, okay. We normally take medication to make our life better. This medication is a lethal dose of a drug to kill you, to end your life. And that's really important. Really saying it's medication, again, is fudging it a bit. Because this medication is purely there and designed to end your life. It's not there to make you feel better. So that's one word. Yes, well, it is. It's a lethal dose of drugs specifically designed to end your life. The other term it used is hasten death. Now, again, I would argue this is a bit of a fudge. And ethically, it's really important to know a distinction. Because it doesn't hasten your death, this stuff actually causes your death. And and the key thing is the intent for which a drug is given. Because it's this point that people often confuse the delivery of morphine as palliative care to take away pain as someone is in the dying process. And to be honest, when you talk to palliative care doctors, they would say it's a bit of an old wives' tale that morphine ends your life. They would say if that's the purpose for it, you wouldn't use morphine. It's not a good drug. It's a very good drug for taking pain away, but it's not a good drug for ending life. If the drug is given with the intent to end a life, that is assisted suicide or euthanasia. If a drug is given to relieve pain or allow death to take its course, that is palliative care, and it's legal within New Zealand, and we do it all the time. Thank goodness. There is another option that is not euthanasia or assisted suicide, and it's really important that we know that distinction very clearly when we vote. Currently, there is a very clear line in New Zealand law between palliative action and causing death. If this law comes in, that line becomes very fuzzy and very grey and will be very difficult. So you can see it by a couple of graphs. If you become sick and your body is fading, we can apply support systems, and that could be medication. So for example, if that's cancer, you can have chemotherapy that might prolong your life or ease your symptoms, but actually it's not going to save you, and you can choose not to have that treatment anymore, and you will die of your disease. You're not dying of the medication, you are dying of your disease. You might have an onset of illness and a support mechanism is applied. You might go onto a ventilator, for example. Now that's going to prolong your life, but then it could be decided that someone is not going to recover, the ventilator is switched off, and they die. It's the ventilator that's keeping someone alive, and you're allowing them to die of their condition. If someone becomes ill and you administer a drug for assisted suicide or euthanasia, they die at that point. Their life is shortened. The intent of the drug is to end their life. And that's a very clear ethical distinction. So there is a difference. It's very important to recognise that these practices, which are legal and currently part of palliative services in New Zealand, are not assisted suicide or euthanasia. Sometimes people use this term passive euthanasia. There is no such thing as passive euthanasia. It's an old term and it doesn't exist. Switching off life support machines, disconnecting feeding tubes, not carrying out life-extending operations, not giving life-extending drugs like antibiotics, when you can sign a non-intervention order like a do not resuscitate. Those are legal options in New Zealand that any one of us can enact right now when you're competent to dictate the terms of your ongoing care. We have these things called advanced care directives, which means you can state now how you would like to be treated if, you have a stroke. You can actually say, I don't want to suffer and I don't want intervention. I'd like palliative services so I don't die in pain, but I don't want intervention. You can do that now. That's not what this bill is about. And if you take nothing else away from tonight, please take that away. We're not talking about legalising things that are already legal. We're talking about bringing in to our medical system new things, which means we end and stop someone's life. And it's really important because polling shows us that 70 to 74% of people are confused about what the bill's bringing in. They think the bill is bringing in those things. It's not. Those things exist. And they're legal. The bill is bringing in something new. It's adding the ending of life as a choice for sickness or terminal illness. Now, it's important to realise too that the bill says the purpose of this action is to relieve someone's suffering. So the desire is, in a sense, for people that want this, a compassionate action to relieve someone's suffering. And they define suffering in this way: a person who experiences unbearable suffering that cannot be relieved in a manner the person considers tolerable. So the first thing to note is suffering is self-defined. I, the terminal patient, define what my suffering is. Not a specialist, not anyone else, only me. And again, that relieve in a manner that the person defines tolerable means actually treatment doesn't come into it. Because actually, for some of us, the treatment might seem quite reasonable. But for this person, the treatment isn't reasonable, and that's grounds enough for them to be able to opt for this. So it doesn't take treatment into account, it's self-defined. And the other thing to be aware of is suffering is a very multi-dimensional aspect. Suffering involves many, many aspects that need to be kind of talked about and worked through. Just to have a look at these 4 categories: loss of autonomy, pressure from relatives or becoming a burden, fear of pain or suffering, and reduced enjoyment of life. Just where you are, in your own heads, pick the one that you think ranks number one, the number one reason why people would ask for assisted suicide or euthanasia. So just have a look at those 4 options. Pick the one that you think would be the number one reason. So just keep that in your head and we'll do a little survey. Okay. Who thinks loss of autonomy would be the number one reason why people would elect euthanasia or assisted suicide? That's things like personal choice. I have the right as an individual to choose. So this is the number one reason why you would choose.
This is what other people think, or what?
Well, it can be what you think, but it's what would you think the majority of people would say. Yeah. Oh, is that okay?
Because we were thinking loss of your own, you, the person.
Yep.
No longer have control over what happens to you.
So they've done surveys overseas of people who have asked for this, and you can see what the majority reason is. So just rather than your individual choice, what do you think would be the majority reason that people elect? Sorry, is that clear or is it unclear? So we'll go loss of autonomy. Who ranked that as think would be the number one reason? Okay, what about fear of pain and suffering? There's quite a few there. What about pressure from relatives? Autonomy is the number one reason someone requests. Being not able to engage in activities that make life enjoyable is the number 2 reason. Loss of dignity is the number 3 reason. Burden on family is number 4. Pain and suffering is right down the bottom. Yeah, the majority of people who request this are not requesting it because of fear of pain and suffering. So, all of these feed into this idea of suffering. And most of them are actually kind of psychosocial, mental things, in the sense of they're social concerns. They're not actually physical medical concerns. They're the concerns you alleviate by talking with other people and talking with your family and talking through the issues and the fears and the worries. These are not the things that you deal with via medication, for example. So it's worth knowing that when you see, and you can see sometimes TV ads or things in the newspaper, they often talk about pain being the thing that people fear the most. It isn't. Palliative specialists would say, actually we can deal with pain pretty much the majority of the time. It's these other things that you need to talk through that are the major concerns for people as they approach decisions about assisted suicide. So when you go to your doctor and you request it, pain is very much a less concern. It's all these other issues that worry people the most. Can I come back to a question, Robina? Okay. So, New Zealand, we've been talking about this for quite a while, actually, since 1995. And more recently, we've now got the bill before us, David Seymour's End of Life Choice Bill, which has now become the End of Life Choice Act. And now we're at the process of a binding referendum. It's interesting, Jesse Mulligan on the project a few weeks ago said, surely we've been talking about this for 16 odd years, why don't we just get on with it? Which is fine to say that, but do we want to vote in a bad law just for the sake of getting on with it? There's a reason we've been talking about it, and there's a reason time and time again we've actually been saying no. So we need to unpack the reasons, not just think, let's get on with it. I want to draw your attention to the Justice Select Committee process, which is the process that the government went through to hold discussions through New Zealand before Parliament then kind of refined the bill that we have before us. This was the largest process in New Zealand's parliamentary history. So there was over 39,000 written submissions and 1,350 oral submissions. What you need to recognise is 91.8% of those submissions were against this law. By far the majority of submissions on this bill were against the law. And what's significant is the number of submissions. So when you hear people like David Seymour say, well, all the polls say that 75% of New Zealand are for it, well, those polls generally survey 2,000 to 3,000 people, and there's no guarantee that person has any idea what the bill actually talks about. Generally speaking, these are submissions from people who've looked at the bill or looked at the issues and are making submissions. Of 93% of the doctors who made submissions said no. The majority of the medical profession do not want this law coming into place because they're going to be the ones told to enact it, and they don't want it. The New Zealand Medical Association, who made one submission, by the way, so they would be one submission out of the 91.8. They represent 5,000 doctors across the country, and they said, even if it becomes law, it is still unethical. They will not be recommending their members get involved. It's worth noting, of those who said no, only 10% cited religious reasons. Now, I'm here I'm an Anglican minister, so I'm already tarred by many with a brush because I'm religious. But actually, the majority of reasons for this bill are not religious reasons. There are very good religious reasons, I think, why you shouldn't be for this bill, but there are also plenty of normal ethical reasons why I believe this bill is bad. So of those who said no, only 10% cited religious reasons. Now that's very different from what you hear from people like David Seymour, who kind of says, oh, it's basically a pack of religious that are against it. That's actually not true. And it's very much not true when you see figures like that.
Great.
Yeah.
One of the things on my mind for a while is really accentuating is the thought around, if I'm a doctor and I don't wish to honour the request
Yep.
of my patient to assist in the end of life, then what happens?
Can we hold on to that? Because I've got a slide in 2 slides' time. Yeah.
I was just wondering, do you have any idea what lawyers' legal side submitted? Obviously, quite high.
They were arranged. There's a whole number of lawyers who said this is bad legislation. So, yes, mixed opinions. But, I mean, it's interesting that Parliament chose to go ahead, even though very clearly the process and the parliamentary process of the Select Committee said the majority of people are against this. So Parliament has gone ahead. So we've got the bill, we've got this Act before us, but the process has actually said we don't want it. So I think there's other agendas kind of rolling around. It's worth noting that during the parliamentary debates, so they have an initial debate, then a second and a third, there were 3 changes made to the bill. A significant rewrite by David Seymour to take out a phrase called irredeemable conditions. His original bill basically was for any condition. It wasn't just terminal. Okay, so the original part of the bill was much broader. He took that out and left terminal in because he knew the other parties would not vote for it. So that's political expedience for you. There are 2 other changes in the bill which were to do with having a binding referendum. The other 111 changes proposed during Parliament for the bill were rejected by Parliament. And a lot of those changes were to make it safer and to define terms like euthanasia and assisted dying. Parliament rejected those terms. It's worth noting that in Victoria, the state of Victoria in Australia, which has had assisted suicide only for about the last, since 2019, so kind of 6 to 8 months, their bill is something like 3 times longer. Ours is 33 pages, theirs is 100 and something pages. And they've got 68 specific safety clauses written into it. It's a very different piece of legislation than ours. Ours is quite lightweight, which I think is quite dangerous. It's worth noting there was a Doctors Say No campaign, of which there were 1,500 doctors signed a letter to say no. And that was like a petition to Parliament. There was a Doctors Say Yes campaign, 30 doctors signed that. So, you often hear, oh yes, but there was a Doctors Say Yes campaign. Yeah, but there was 30 compared to 1,500. And when you add things like New Zealand Medical Association, it becomes much, much more impressive. Also with the third reading, in the final vote, the majority of electorate MPs, they voted no. The bill actually went through Parliament because New Zealand First and the Greens voted en bloc, not via their conscience. They effectively did a party vote. So this bill has got through to where it is a referendum, I think, on quite politically expedient reasons. So why do people say yes? Why do people say no? What are the reasons for and against? This is a table, and a lot of these kind of reasons you can actually read. This is a really good book. I wouldn't normally recommend a book by a journalist because I think sometimes the journalists are quite biased in New Zealand. But Carolee Strays is an investigative journalist who's worked for Fairfax Media. She went through the Justice Select Committee submissions, and she's done a whole lot of interviewing of people for the bill and against the bill. And each chapter she's written up is her interview with those people. And then you kind of get taken through the story of how she's formed her opinion. So it's actually quite objective, and it's very good. In a nutshell, she basically says, this situation is way more complex than I thought it was. Spoiler alert, she said at the end, I'll vote no, because it's more complex. And she's approached it as a journalist. I've got no idea if she's got a religious perspective at all. But it's a very good book. I've been saying to people, if you do nothing else to get informed, read that. So the final choice. You can buy it at Whitcoulls and Paper Plus and things like that. So some of the reasons, or a lot of the reasons quoted for yes, individual autonomy and choice. I have a right to choose what I do with my own body. Being in control. If I control everything else in my life, I can surely control the time, place, and means of my death. Self-reliance is a bit like control. Maintaining dignity. That's a big one. Sorry for being crass, but a lot of people don't like the thought of someone else wiping their bum. And that's in the book, by the way. I didn't make that up. But there's a big challenge to that. And the disability sector have picked this one up, because for a lot of disabled people, actually being that dependent on people, even to the point of those really personal cares, is actually what keeps them alive. So are you saying that having those personal cares, including having your bum wiped, makes you any less of a person or takes away your dignity as a human being? The disability sector would actually say, no, it doesn't. So there's a bit of a fishtail in that argument. Distinctions between existing and living. That's the whole idea that there are some activities that I need to undertake to make my life enjoyable. And if I can't do that, then I move from living a full life to just existing. And there are some ethicists in the world that would say, Peter Singer's one of them, if you are just existing, then actually you're less than human. So it would be okay to have your own life taken in this sense. Because full human beings is about living in enjoyment. The comfort of having a choice. So we've heard a lot about Lucretia Seals, the lawyer, who kind of sparked the recent case. Even her family has said if this was around, or if the judge has said yes, she could have this, she probably wouldn't have taken it. But mere fact of having a choice would provide comfort. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that's a pretty selfish approach. To have a law for everyone, that means people can choose to end their life, but it gives me comfort. Even if I'm actually not going to go through with it. Many lawyers have said, actually, you don't write laws for a few or for extreme cases. You write laws for everyone, and you have a robust system that can deal with the extreme cases if and when they happen. And we have had cases in New Zealand where people have taken the life of a relative who is suffering, and the court has dealt with that. And generally speaking, they've dealt with it compassionately. So we have a system that can deal with these things, but you don't make a law for everyone based on a few extreme conditions. The fear of dying badly, and as we've already talked about, actually, that's not the main reason why people choose the stuff. And we have palliative care in place that can cope with that. Our problem in New Zealand is more about access and funding. We don't have good palliative services. We have excellent palliative services in New Zealand and hospice services. We have very poor access to those services, especially in rural New Zealand. If you're close to a big centre, generally there's a really good hospice, and we have fantastic palliative specialists. My daughter's in her final year of med school, and med students get an hour on this stuff in a 6-year degree. But I would hate to think that my daughter as a med student might get lectures on how do you administer drugs to end, terminal drugs. That would be a bit scary. Reasons for saying no, the value of life. Now, there are religious views around the value of life, but actually our whole Western society, which has a Judeo-Christian base, values life because of that. We always say life is valuable. That's why we have laws to say that you cannot take the life of another person. That will change if we bring this in. We value life as a principle of society, whether you're religious or not. Care for the vulnerable is a big one. We've talked about the view of disabled and dignity. Mental health issues, Indigenous peoples. We'll come back to that because that's a very important part of the conversation. Lack of inadequate safeguards. I've got some slides of that in a minute. Significant changes to the doctor-patient relationship. In countries where they do have this, Canada's had these laws for a couple of years. Something like 50% of the doctors pulled their names off the list after they did their first euthanasia. It is traumatic. Doctors generally don't go into medicine to end people's lives. They go into medicine to help people. It changes the relationship fundamentally if you know your doctor is supportive of this practice. And it also doesn't prevent doctor shopping. If your doctor says no, well, we can go down the road to one that does. Normalisation and extension of criteria. We'll look at that in a minute. Overseas evidence clearly shows that over time these practices become normal. In the Netherlands, the majority of cancer patients die by euthanasia. They don't die of their cancer. So it becomes normal, and what we see over time is that even though the law may not change, its interpretation and its practice does clearly change. And actually currently in 3 places, Canada, Oregon and the Netherlands, they are currently enacting law changes to extend the criteria and make it more available. We'll talk about that in a minute. Safeguards. Is this bill safe? That's a key question. If you're going to bring in a law that's talking about ending people's lives, we need to know, is it safe? Well, this law has a 2-doctor safeguard, but there's no evidence that certainly the second doctor has to have any long-term relationship with the patient. They're the person called in without knowing the person. Overseas evidence shows that the average length of time that the doctor and the patient know each other is about 10 to 14 weeks. So how can that doctor assess coercion, family pressure? We're not talking in this bill about going to the GP that your family have had for the last 30 years. And I don't know about over in Blenheim, but the average consult time in Nelson is what, 15 minutes? You know, you're not talking about a process that means there is very robust checks and balances in the process. Coercion is a big thing with this. Can your family pressure you? Or can you perceive that your family's pressured you? What about the pressure of society? Do you perceive that society is pressuring you if they bring this in? You know, are we saying as a society that for some people we'd rather not have them? Yep.
Could the family, if there's an EPA, Eternal Power of Attorney,
Yep.
could the family request that the relative...
No, so it's not part of... At the moment, it's not part of enduring power of attorney or advanced care directives. But I know the pro-euthanasia lobby group want it to be part of advanced care directives. And that will change the game, because overseas what you find is someone's written an advanced care directive, they've got dementia, the doctor and the family are enacting the advanced care directive for assisted suicide or euthanasia, and then the patient with dementia is saying no. They're ignoring the patient and they're going with the advanced care directive. Now that's dangerous because, I mean, my mother was, before she died, in a rest home for 8 years. You know, the cost of that's quite big. It's something like $800 a week. So, you know, there's pressure that can be applied. The doctor has to, and this is the phrase in the bill, do their best to assure that pressure has not been applied to the person. Now, what does doing their best mean? Can anyone here define what doing their best would actually mean? How could a case be brought against a doctor who we felt didn't do their best? Because what does doing their best mean? When the only evidence you've got is the doctor's evidence because they've gone through the request sheet. So it's going to be a bill that's very hard to manage and prosecute and ensure that best practice is happening. Well, that's another part of it. I mean, they don't say the old Hippocratic Oath, but they say something very similar that would encompass about doing good without doing harm. Yeah. So, yes, the argument would be that we're doing this to relieve someone's suffering, therefore we're doing good. We are acting compassionately by ending someone's life to relieve suffering. So that would be their argument. I would personally have troubles with that argument, but there's no mandatory psychological assessment. That is not a mandatory requirement. It's only required a reference to a psychologist if one of those two doctors feel the person is mentally impaired. Now, I've got some colleagues who are, psychiatrists or retired psychiatrists, and they would say, even for a psychiatrist, it's really hard to assess the level of someone's depression in particular. Depression is a really hard thing to assess, how much that is impacting on someone's ability to make decisions. You certainly can't do it quickly in a first consult. So not having a mandatory psychological assessment is a major flaw, I think, because there's a whole lot of people who might choose this because at the moment they're feeling depressed. And if you're told you've got a terminal illness, depression is part of that process.
What happens in, say, Canada or Netherlands? Do they have a psychologist?
They do, but what we find, Oregon's a good case in point, because in Oregon, they track these things, they're supposed to have reporting, but what you find is that the amount of psychological assessment reduces over time. So there's a lack of reporting. Doctors are under-reporting or under-referring to psychiatrists for that assessment, which means they're actually extending the criteria, because actually they're either ignoring or they're actually thinking, well, if someone's got such severe depression, why not? So it's a bit tricky. It's very fraught. There's no mandatory family consultation. You do not have to consult with your family if you want to go through with this. It's recommended that you consult with your family, but it's not compulsory. So your relative could choose to do this and not tell you as a family, and they are perfectly within their legal rights to do so. So that's another point. There's no cooling off period. In most other countries where they have assisted suicide or euthanasia, there's a 10 to 14 day or 10 to 15 day cooling off period, whereby basically they're saying, go away, think about it, and then come back and we'll talk about it a bit more. In New Zealand, our legislation doesn't have that. I've been told the minimum time between request and enacting in New Zealand will be 4 days.
I think it's also quite important to know that that was actually one of the submissions and it was voted against.
Yep, highly likely. So, that's a significant thing. You could be told by your doctor you've got a terminal illness. You could say to your doctor, I don't want treatment. Tell me about assisted suicide or euthanasia. You go through the forms. You cannot tell your family. You might choose no psychological assessment. Assessed by another doctor, the two of them agree. 4 days later, you can enact it. So we've got a very risky piece of legislation. As I said, there's no requirement for a doctor to have a long-term relationship. Now, going back to your point, a doctor can object. Your GP can choose to object. But as soon as they do, they must, and they get fined if they don't, they must refer you to this group called the SENS group, which is a group of doctors who are in favour of this practice, and they will refer you to someone else who will. So if you object as a doctor, you must legally refer to a group that will enable you if they deem you meet the criteria. Which for some doctors is really problematic, because they feel even if we conscientiously object, we're being forced to participate in the situation, because we must refer you to people who we know will enact your request.
They will feel forced to do so because if the person survives more than 6 months as terminal illness,
Yep.
the person would sue them if they would.
Well, we can't in New Zealand, unfortunately. We don't have that kind of process. If it was America, yeah, you probably could, but it's really problematic when you have to refer. You can't object really as a doctor. I think what will happen in New Zealand is what they find in Canada. A small number of doctors will do the majority of the assisted suicides or euthanasia. Yes. Yeah. She had a really interesting point, because what they are finding, especially in Canada now, Canada's interesting because their legal system is different. The court can force Parliament to change the law. Here, the courts can only say to Parliament, we think you should change the law, and Parliament has to go through a process. So there's a different process about how Canadians get law. You take people to court. and as soon as the law came into Canada, there were law cases lined up especially around extending the criteria like the age limit and the types of illnesses through which people could ask for assisted suicide.
So I've got a draft policy, I think they're hoping to make it available, I think was it about 13-year-old, and they don't have to tell their parents.
Yep. So the biggest children's hospital in Canada is already drawing up policies so that a child can request this, so a child maybe with severe disabilities, and they don't have to tell their parents. Because actually, if you can prove competency, a child is perfectly able through medical ethics.
It's only a period of 2 or 3 years, isn't it? It's happened very quickly.
Yeah. So Canada's only had this law for 2 years. But how they get their laws is different to us. But our law, as it's written, is very similar to the Canadian law and very similar to the Oregon law because they tend to all peel off each other. There is a registrar, so once a request is received, all the paperwork goes to a registrar who reviews it, rubber stamps it, sends it back to the doctor and goes, yay or nay. Okay? And then there is a review committee that looks at all the bits of paperwork, maybe once a year or twice a year, to review the practice and how it's going through New Zealand. Now, all those reviews are the review committee is after the fact. If they find a problem, it's too late. The person may well already be dead. So, now, this last bit, we'll look at what do we see overseas. Now, I've got some other slides that have specific numbers, but for these two, for purposes of time, I'll look at some trends that we see overseas. The first thing to note is that the majority of jurisdictions in the world, and it's jurisdictions, not countries, because things like the states, United States, the states are individual legal entities, and same with Australia. They're individual legal entities. They make their own laws. The majority of jurisdictions around the world have rejected euthanasia or assisted suicide. This is not a global movement sweeping the Western world. This is not what progressive countries are doing en masse. And I think we're being sold a bit of a lie that this is what progressive countries do. In particular, Canada. We tend to look to Canada as very similar in terms of people, countryside, or, they're bigger. But, I think we're being sold a bit of a lie that this is a progressive thing that progressive countries like to do, and we all know New Zealand likes to be progressive. But the majority have said no. Since 2015, over 30 have said no, 15 had said yes, and the majority of that 15 have only allowed assisted suicide. So because we've got these two practices tied together, we've got assisted suicide and euthanasia, we are going to be in a very select club. And I would argue a very dangerous club. If you go back further, say to 2000, you're looking at over 150 legal jurisdictions have said no. Again, the majority of the world is looking at this kind of legislation and they are saying no. Now that's a message New Zealanders need to hear, because I think we're being led down a path that says this is a movement that's sweeping the world, we've got to get on board. It's not. What we tend to see, changes in practice rather than law. So those who are for this practice can say, well, the laws are safe, they're not changing in foreign countries. The laws aren't changing, but how they're applying those laws very much are. The age limit is being reduced. The conditions for which someone may seek assisted suicide or euthanasia is well beyond terminal to disability, to mental health, dementia. Now, when you move into dementia, that's problematic because it means you're moving from voluntary euthanasia to involuntary euthanasia, i.e. you haven't requested it, but your family has, or the doctor has. So that's another set of problematic situations. Year on year increase in numbers and underreporting. So in countries like the Netherlands, what they find is the number of reports is less, but things like palliative sedation palliative sedation in many cases is actually euthanasia or assisted suicide. Rates of assisted dying when euthanasia is allowed is about 10 times more, as I've said, in places compared to assisted suicide only. So the fact that we have a law that is both assisted suicide and euthanasia, means that we will be in the situation, I believe, where more people will access this. Whereas what you hear from the politicians is this is only there for the very few rare cases that want to access this. I don't believe that at all. And you look at the pro-euthanasia groups. There's a very strong one in Nelson. I don't know what there is in Blenheim. You're going to have more than just the extreme cases.
I think there's funding this time, and I think the whole economic thing.
Yep.
As you touched on before, it costs a lot of money to run rest homes.
Yep, very much so.
Run a hospice, and in those countries, euthanasia has to be offered as a form of treatment for cancer.
Yep.
And so of course, it's going to be a lot cheaper if most people opt for euthanasia than to get a
Oh, it's definitely cheaper, yeah. And we have to be careful in New Zealand. We've really got a perfect storm where we've got, inequitable funding and access. We've got an aged population bubble coming through. We know elder abuse is rising in New Zealand, and doctors will say it's really hard to detect, and social services would say it's very hard to detect. So, it's very hard to detect elder abuse. How are we going to detect coercion or, pressure? It's even more difficult. That's okay. So overseas, extension of criteria, not necessarily changing the law, but how the law is applied. To those under 18, we've heard about children in the Netherlands, people with mental health conditions, including depression, people with disabilities, and I'll talk about one of those in a minute. And an expectation, really, that if you're disabled, you almost get this implied pressure that you're costing us a lot of money. Involuntary, when it moves to dementia. Completed life. In the Netherlands, the proposed law change to completed life, that got held up through lockdown with COVID-19. But there's a bill in the Netherlands currently that anyone over the age of 70 can ring up a line and say, I think I've lived long enough, that's enough reason to receive assisted suicide or euthanasia. It's called the Completed Life Bill. So you can just decide, I've had enough. That's it. I mean, that's frightening. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen in New Zealand, but what I want you to see is where these laws end up. That's the vital thing. Yep.
Graham, just to clarify, is there a difference between criteria changing and law changing?
No. The criteria changing, some of them are moving to change the law to legally reduce the age limit. But what you find overseas is that the practice changes. So doctors are allowing people less than 18 to receive this and not being prosecuted for it. So, again, it's very hard to prosecute if the only witness is actually already dead. And there's been some cases recently. There was one a couple of years ago of, I can't remember what country it was. It might have been the Netherlands. A 20-year-old sexual abuse victim. So clearly, traumatic, but was saying my life, obviously mental health issues, in her mind, can't be solved in a way she wants. She received euthanasia or assisted suicide. So you can just see how these things snowball. And you can understand the logic. I'll talk about Roger Foley. He's a very interesting case study in Canada and Ontario. So he's got a terminal neurological disease. He needs high-level 24-hour care. He wants to live at home, and he wants to manage his own care at home until he dies. He's competent enough to do so. The care he was receiving at home by the state-funded carers was so poor, he became mentally and physically unwell, and he's been in hospital because of that for the last 4 years. So he's stuck in hospital. He's currently suing the hospital and the State Attorney General because the only options the government have offered him are to stay in hospital and pay for it, have home-based care from the same government-funded carers who put him into hospital in the first place, or the state will pay for his assisted suicide. So it's become part of the medical delivery suite. And really, he's suing them because they're not giving him the choice he wants. He's not you may say it's freedom of choice for some, but actually it very much restricts the choice of another. And the whole thing of choice and individual, there's not a single person in this room who's completely free to do whatever they like. We live in a society. We are relational beings. So your choices impact my choices. The things I do impact the things you do. That's because we live in society. So this idea of autonomous, independent choice doesn't really exist. For him, his choice has actually been taken away because it's cheaper and it's more pragmatic for the state to pay for his assisted suicide than for the state to support him to live and to die. He knows he's got a terminal illness the way he wants to. So there's a logic behind this. And the Royal Society of Canada, so that's the Royal Society, a legal society, have said there's no principal basis for excluding people suffering greatly and permanently and not imminently dying. Because if we say death is good for some, there's no basis to say it's not good for all. And you can't put just an age limit to say it's good for those over 18 with terminal illness. Well, what about the person at 17 and a half with terminal illness? Does 6 months really make a difference? Actually, logically, it doesn't make a difference at all. So there is a natural logic in this practice of assisted suicide and euthanasia, which means the criteria will be extended. Professor Leo Boer is in the Netherlands. He was actually one of these people on the review committees. He helped bring the Netherlands law into being. And he says now the very existence of a euthanasia law turns assisted suicide from a last resort into a normal practice. And he goes on to say, don't make our mistake. And he came out and he spoke to Parliament on this. But if death is a good for some, actually then we're making it a good for all. We can't say it's not good for you, but it's good for you. A couple of other quick points to note. Will extension happen in New Zealand? Or extension will not happen in New Zealand? My little facetious comment is, yeah, right. And the reason for that is severalfold. The original bill included a clause which basically made it any issue that I felt was affecting me, that was impacting my life to a point where I was suffering as I felt. So the original intent of the bill was to have broad criteria. It was not restricted to terminal illness. So you can be pretty sure there will be moves to bring that back in. Assisted dying clauses and advanced care directives. We've already talked about that. You can write an advanced care directive, but there will be a push that a clause in there will be, if I have X condition and I am terminal and will be dying within 6 months, I would like to receive euthanasia or assisted, it would have to be euthanasia at this point, or assisted suicide. As I've said, the Attorney General has said our age limit of 18 is discriminatory. So there will be a move to change that. Now, there is actually a little Trojan horse in the back end of the bill, which says that after 3 years, this bill will be reviewed, and the phrase is, consider whether any amendments to this Act or any other enactment are necessary or desirable. Now, what's desirable about this? How do you amend this Act in a way that's desirable? And desirable for whom? Well, if we look at overseas legislation, the only way the desirability will go is to extend criteria and broaden it and enable more people to receive this practice. So I would say at 3 years, there will be a massive push to change this legislation and extend the criteria. Now, I can't say that for sure, but I think if we look at where the bill originally was placed and what was the original intent of the bill, we can be pretty sure there will be a push to get that back up and running. A couple of other things I'll just mention briefly before we have some questions. The debate in New Zealand has really lacked Indigenous voices. We've talked to a lot of Maori, and I know from Maori Anglicans, Maori are against this bill. If you look worldwide, Indigenous cultures are not for these practices because generally speaking, they are amongst the most vulnerable in their societies. And Maori practice means that actually they care for their dying as much as they can. So, we run the risk as generally speaking, white educated pākehā of bringing in a legislation that's going to put pressure, even if it's not spoken, on Māori and Pacific. A dignified death is not guaranteed. I've already mentioned that. That actually there's a number of situations where these practices do not result in a good, peaceful, dignified death. You know, we have the pictures, don't we, on the movies, you know, the couple popping a couple of pills with a glass of Chardonnay and falling asleep on the couch, and then it kind of zooms out. That's not guaranteed. Your body does not like receiving lethal medication. So, you know, people throw it back up. People have seizures. They react to the medication wrongly. And it's worth knowing, if it's euthanasia by lethal injection, it's the same process of, you know, for capital punishment. You receive an injection to knock you out and paralyse you, and you receive a second injection to stop your heart. And, you know, as a country, we don't want that practice. So it's quite funny that we have two different attitudes to this thing. Oregon, 6% of assisted suicides have complications. Now, this is a controversial one. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but there is some evidence overseas that in some places when these laws come in, that unassisted suicide rates also go up. Now, I think that's a big concern for New Zealand because we're already at the top of the OECD ratings for youth suicide. And actually the biggest increase in suicide in New Zealand is the over 65 men. We already have a suicide epidemic. Why do we want to bring in a law that may have, even if it's the slightest potential, to increase that rate? But again, you can see the logic. If it's good for a 65-year-old with terminal cancer to take their own life, then why isn't it good for a 25-year-old to take their own life? And so we're going to set up this imbalance, I think. And it's illogical. I can't see the logic in it. So my view would be, if there's any possibility that this law could increase our suicide rates, then actually we have to be very cautious with that, because we know we already have an epidemic. And that latest one from Oregon, that was a 2019 presidential report by the US Disability Commission. So that's not a lightweight commission. That's a commission, regardless of what you think of Trump, it's a commission done by the US Disability Services. That's pretty relevant, I think, especially because our law is kind of modelled on Oregon, because Oregon seemed to be quite a stable place, but they've even got law changes coming in. What message does this say to elderly, disabled, mentally ill? What are we saying when the right to die becomes a duty to die? When even as a society we send this hidden message that actually you're going to cost us a lot of money. There's a fine line, as I said, between terminally ill and disabled, or just ill. You can stop taking medication. You can stop having the support services you need if you're disabled, and you then become terminal. And that's a big issue for the disability sector. That it doesn't take into account treatment options. Medical insurance is a big one. Overseas in America, insurance companies are saying no to some expensive treatments, but they're saying we'll pay for assisted suicide. Now, we don't have the same medical process here, but actually, how many people here have medical insurance? There's not that many. But, it's something that's growing in New Zealand society. But we've got Pharmac that have to weigh up expensive drugs, and we've had several big debates in New Zealand, haven't we, around Cadruden, the breast cancer drug, the high cost for very few. Can the government afford it? You can see similarities in the discussions around those kind of issues. Government funding, this goes back again to the Canadian example, that there are, in Canada, if you receive government funding and you're a hospice, an elder care facility, a hospital, even if you're one that has a religious basis to it, if you want to receive your government funding, you have to enable these practices. If you don't want to enable these practices, that's fine, but you won't receive government funding. Now, in New Zealand, our hospices are 50% funded by the government. There's no clause in this bill that secures the funding of places like hospice if they choose not to enact these laws. And Hospice New Zealand is against this legislation. So, again, that's a big, big loophole and a big, I think, pressure point. So, as overseas evidence shows us, it's not where we start with respect to this legislation that we need to be thinking about, it's where we end up. And I think the overseas examples are very clear. The criteria gets extended, more people opt in, and it becomes more and more dangerous, especially for those vulnerable in our society. We already have viable options. We have excellent, high-quality palliative care. We have excellent, high-quality hospice services in this country. We have advanced care directives where you can legally now say what care you would like to receive if and when you become unable to communicate that yourself, whether it's through dementia or through accident. The issue we have is we need increased funding. And we know our health budget is really stretched. And we need access to these excellent services for all. That's the solution. It's a costly solution, and it's a solution we all have to bear as a society, but I would argue that's a better solution than the quick fix that's being suggested. So my take home would be that even if you're supportive of euthanasia and assisted suicide, even if you think it's a valid choice that you can make, and you might be thinking of loved ones that you've seen die in ways you might not have wanted, the reality is this is not the law you want to enact it. I would argue it hasn't got the robustness, it hasn't got the safeguards, and it's certainly more dangerous that it's linking assisted suicide and euthanasia. We've got the two practices that bump up the rates and I think make us more vulnerable, not less. So my view, we would have to be incredibly cautious if we're to vote this in. So there's nothing, if New Zealand votes no, this was a private members bill, so private members bills go into almost literally a hat, a ballot box, and they're drawn out randomly on select days during the parliamentary year. So David Seymour's bill was a private members bill. It wasn't promoted by a party, it's promoted by an individual. There's nothing stopping an MP putting another private members bill in the hope that sometime during the parliamentary session it gets drawn out again. I think if New Zealand votes no, I think Parliament, you hope, would have to take incredibly serious cognizance of the fact we've been through this huge process at huge expense and the country has said no. But
well, there were referendums in the past.
I know.
The majority of the government didn't give a...
Yep. And as I said, the majority of electorate MPs voted no. So it's actually under MMP, it's kind of the block vote. I'm a bit miffed at New Zealand First for block voting because they block voted not on the issue because actually they're against assisted suicide and euthanasia. They voted for a referendum. So even in the vote, they didn't vote for the issue. They voted for a referendum because they've got an ideology that it's right for the public to decide. We can't crystal ball gaze as to what the Parliament might do. Yep. So tonight is actually being recorded. So this will go up on the Nelson Anglican website. There's also several other articles there. So one or two that I helped write as part of the Interchurch Bioethics Council. So one is a 10 frequently asked questions, boom, 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 boom. One's a more, expanded version of this talk, looking at, more details of the issues and references and things like that. So that's on the the Nelson Anglican website.
I'm sure your talk's been much easier to understand than if I actually got the act out and tried to.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever read Parliamentary Acts, it's pretty intense. Yep, Family First got stuff. Euthanasia Free New Zealand is another site. Care Alliance is another site. Yeah, so there will, and there is going to be a kind of national vote no campaign kick underway at some stage very soon, I hope. Yeah, I'll kick through these. Hang on. I think there are some Christian distinctives around this debate. You know, about the intrinsic value and dignity of a human life regardless of abilities, situation and context. That actually as human beings we are innately valuable to God. I think that's a key thing. Life is seen as a gift rather than a right. You know, there's a lot of talk of rights and autonomy, but actually as Christians, there's that view that our rights are under God and ultimately before God. The focus on character, who we are as people, and there's a lot of talk around this thing called virtues, which sounds old-fashioned, but it's a way of doing ethics, which means actually, what does it mean to be a virtuous person? Is to do acts that are consistent through your whole life. And you know, not killing would be a virtuous act. The whole point of us being relational beings, communal, that this isn't just about the individual. This is actually about us as a society saying what we think is good practice or not good practice. No matter if you want to go through this as an individual, it's going to affect other people around you. That's just the nature of the game. And as I said earlier, my rights aren't just my rights. You know, we're all bound by laws. We need laws, otherwise we get anarchy. But I can't just do what I like because that will hurt you or you. It'll affect you. So, and then you get to this whole thing of what does it mean about compassion? What do we mean by compassion? I'm actually preaching at St Barnabas Nativity, on the 30th of August on this issue of, you know, is this really compassionate action? The pro-lobby is called Vote Yes with Compassion. But are we talking about something that we can call compassionate action? Now, I don't see anywhere in the Bible where it says that it's compassionate to take another person's life, even if it is to relieve their suffering. The compassionate action is to help them, to walk beside them, to journey with them, to go through that process with them so that they don't go through it alone, and to relieve their suffering as much as I humanly can. But I think there is a definite no when it comes to ending their life. You know, we need to do good without doing harm. You know, unconditional love is about care and compassion without doing harm. And I think throughout human society and certainly within the Bible, you know, the taking of a life is a harm. It's never seen as a good. Not with this law, because if your practice says no, they have to refer you to a national body who then will refer you to another doctor who will say yes.
And is it the practice that refers that says no, or the individuals?
I don't know actually. I'm meaning to ask my GP that exact same question and ask him, you know, what's your position on this and what's your practice's position on this? Yeah.
Being such a healthy young man, you get people who have voted before you get a chance.
Yeah. So yeah, but it's interesting that, you know, that may be the rule that you can't just doctor shop to get a new doctor in general, but actually with this law, you were referred to a national body who has a list of doctors who are happy to engage in the practice, and they have to go through the process.
You won't be shifting doctors for long, though, will you?
No. So probably got time for one more question if anyone's got a... Oh, go through it. Well, it becomes problematic when, you know, at best one of the doctors may know you for a reasonable length of time. The second doctor is brought in as effectively as a consultant to kind of do one, you know, to say yes, I believe this person would be eligible. When you move out to if you have to get referred to the SENS group.
I don't think you would. I think there would be enough doctors within the practice. Some would be for and some would be against.
But if your doctor says no, he has to refer you to the SENS group.
Yes.
And the doctors who are for will be on a list that the SENS group have, and they'll go down, oh yeah, there's another person 2 doors down. Yeah. Sorry, last question. Yep. Yeah, it is. And the bill, I mean, the bill does say you can't discriminate against someone for either being for or against. So that there is a section in the bill that deals with employment. But I mean, that becomes very problematic, doesn't it? When you have groups like Hospice New Zealand who are against, you would want to probably ask your employees. Yeah, it becomes very problematic. So.
Can I just ask one
Oh,
question?
okay.
Have there been any whispers from life insurance companies?
Not that I've heard of in New Zealand, and I mean, I haven't physically read all the submissions. But one interesting point you might want to note is that on the death certificate, so if someone receives assisted suicide or euthanasia, the doctor signs the death certificate as if you died of the condition of cancer. It has to be recorded somewhere else that you received assisted suicide or euthanasia, but on the death certificate, if you received it, it'll state the illness you had. So if it's terminal cancer, it will be cancer. Yes, they had said terminal illness. I would have thought the death certificate would say, even if it was assisted suicide, euthanasia, bracket, cancer. I would have thought that's more honest. I think part of the problem with that is if you say suicide on a death certificate, you would void life insurance. Because life insurance policies tend to have a you can't take your own life clause. Unfortunately, even if you were about to die of... so that's a little thing that's in the law that, yeah. So, I mean, happy to keep talking one-on-one, but I'm conscious of time and I'm Saturday night. So thank you for coming. I hope it's been informative. And as I said, if you want to know more, read that book. It's really good.